Good morning, everyone. This morning, we are going to be unleashing the power of plant-based diets, and I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting on this amazing conference. First, my disclosures, no potential conflicts of interest. And I will begin with a very brief outline. We are going to start by talking about the strength of the link between diet and disease. We'll move on to talking about the evidence for plant-based diets, and we will conclude the presentation with a practical piece, 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet for disease prevention and reversal. I would like to begin by sharing a little story about my dad. This happened, it was for sure 40 years ago. I was in university and I was visiting my parents during March break. And I can remember being in the kitchen preparing some food and my dad walking by me with 2 cigarettes hanging out of his mouth and the chips and licorice and Coke underneath his arms, and he turned to me with this big cheeky grin, stuck his belly out as far as it would go, and just kind of sauntered by me. And of course, I gave him the look of utter disgust. And a couple of hours later, I went to him and I said, "Dad, I don't understand why you're doing this. We love you and we want you to be around for a long time." And he said to me, he said, "You know, Bren," he said, "I would rather spend 50 years or live 50 years having the freedom to enjoy what I enjoy. I want to be buried with my cigarettes and blueberry pies." And he said, "You know, I could get hit by a truck tomorrow." And I looked at him and I said, "I know, Dad, but it doesn't mean you should be walking out in front of one." This is what we know. We know that 70% of deaths globally are due to chronic diseases of our own making. An estimated 90% of type 2 diabetes, 80% of heart disease, and 40 to 70% of cancers are considered entirely preventable. 10 years ago, the World Health Organization identified what they believed to be the 4 big lifestyle culprits: sedentary lifestyle, alcohol, tobacco, and an unhealthy diet. And they defined an unhealthy diet as one that is based on processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, and animal products rich in saturated fats. It's low in vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and other high fiber foods. At the highest risk are inactive populations consuming Western style diets. The highest rates globally are in North America, Northern Europe, Australia, and of course, all of the developing countries that are adopting our Western ways. The lowest risk are populations who live simply, are physically active, and consume unprocessed plant-based diets. The lowest rates globally are some parts of rural Asia, South America, and of course, the people of the blue zones where there are more centenarians than anywhere else on the planet. This is where people live the longest, healthiest lives. And there are 5 blue zones: the Loma Linda, California, with Seventh-day Adventists there, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, and Okinawa, Japan. And some of the lifestyle practices are unique to each blue zone. Some are shared by 2 or more blue zones, as you can see in this Venn diagram to the right. And some are common to every single blue zone that we know of. And those are strong families. They're socially engaged. They do constant, moderate physical activity. They tend not to smoke. And where diet is concerned, they all consume plant-based diets, and they all use legumes as dietary staples. And the evidence for plant-based diets continues to mount. And I think some of the most compelling evidence is by looking at cohorts of individuals who live similar healthy lifestyles, but have different dietary patterns. And there are three cohorts or three populations we've been following for some time. One in North America, and this is the Adventist Health Study 2, with over 96,000 participants. This study began in 2002 and is ongoing. The second is in the UK. It's called EPIC Oxford with over 65,000 participants. It began in 1993 and is ongoing. And then a population in Taiwan where there are two separate study groups. One is the Tzu Health Study with over 6,000 participants, which began in 2007. And then the Tzu Vegetarian Study with over 12,000 participants that began in 2005. Now, what's really interesting about these cohorts is people in these health conscious cohorts diet about half the rates of the general population in their region, which means that when we compare vegans in these cohorts with omnivores in these cohorts, we're not comparing vegans with people who are sitting on the couch eating a sad or standard American diet. We're comparing vegans with omnivores who are health conscious, who eat well, who exercise about the same amount, smoke about the same amount, drink about the same amount. So we're comparing people with very similar lifestyles. So we're really looking at the consequences of the diet. And so what are the findings of these studies? Well, for ischemic heart disease, compared to similar health conscious meat eaters, ischemic heart disease rates were about 13% lower, and this is EPIC Oxford, among pesco-vegetarians, and 22% lower among the lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans. In the Adventist Health Study 2, they were 23% lower among pesco-vegetarian men, 24% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarian men, and 55% lower among vegan men. Now, interestingly, there were no significant differences among the women in this cohort. Hypertension in the Adventist Health Study 2 was 55% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians and 75% lower among vegans compared again to the health conscious non-vegetarians. Now, stroke, there was a study that came out in 2019 that was very concerning to the vegetarian world, and that was EPIC Oxford. And what they found was that stroke was actually higher among the vegetarians and vegans. It was total stroke was 20% higher, and hemorrhagic stroke was 40% higher. And the researchers felt that it may have been because of the low levels of vitamin D, B12, essential amino acids, and long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in this particular cohort. So is this something that we find in all vegetarian cohorts? And the answer is no. In fact, stroke risk was actually found to be lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans in the Adventist Health Study 2 cohort. There was a systematic review of 8 studies that showed vegetarians had a 29% risk reduction for cerebrovascular disease. And in Tzu Chi, compared to non-vegetarians in cohort 1, the Tzu Chi Health Study, ischemic stroke was 74% lower among vegetarians. And in cohort 2, in the Tzu Chi Vegetarian Study, total stroke was 48% lower, ischemic stroke 59%, and hemorrhagic stroke was actually 66% lower. And then we have another study that is a brand new study, 2021, that looked at plant-based diets and plant-based diet quality and risk of stroke. And what they found, and this was the Harvard study with the Nurses Health Study and the Nurses Health Study 2 and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, over 200,000 participants, and they looked at the plant-based diet index, how plant-based is your diet, and stroke risk. And what they found was, compared to participants with the lowest plant-based diet index, the risk of stroke was 6% lower in those with the highest plant-based diet index, but it was 10% lower in those with the highest healthy plant-based diet index. And it was actually 5% higher in those with the highest unhealthy plant-based diet index. And what this means essentially is the unhealthy plant-based diet index is folks who are eating a lot of refined carbohydrates and fried foods and processed foods or heavily processed foods. And the conclusion of the researchers was overall a vegetarian diet is not associated with total stroke, although lower total stroke was observed in those with a healthful plant-based diet. And the take-home message here is diet quality matters for all chronic diseases, plant-based or otherwise. For diabetes, compared again to similar health conscious meat eaters, the risk in Adventist Health Study 2 was 21% lower among pesco vegetarians, 38% lower among lacto-ovo vegetarians, and 62% lower among vegans. Epic Oxford was 35% lower among lacto-ovo, 47% lower among vegans, and actually 53% lower among pesco vegetarians. In the Suchi study, they found that diabetes risk was 51% lower among vegetarian near vegan men and 75% lower among the vegetarian women. And the reason I say near vegan is because the people in this cohort eat very little, if any, dairy. There's just a little bit of eggs, so it really is quite close to vegan. And I wanted to mention the pictures on this slide because I had the privilege of being a presenter at the Suchi International Medical Association conference. And you can see on the top, this meal is actually a typical meal in the cafeteria of the Suchi hospitals. All Suchi hospitals are completely vegetarian. In the lower picture, I was invited to have a tour of the kitchen. And I went into the kitchen and the first thing I saw was just these massive numbers of huge plastic bags filled with greens. And I said to the people that were providing the tour, I said, well, what is this? And they said, well, this is the organic greens that the nuns, these are Buddhist hospitals, that the nuns picked from the gardens this morning. They said, this is the most important food for our patients because it helps them to heal. And I thought, what a concept. Can you imagine hospitals doing this? It just we have a lot to learn from one another. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and this again was a Suchi study, was 21% lower among the vegetarians, and replacing soy with meat or fish increased risk by 12 to 13%. Replacing whole grains with refined grains increased risk 3 to 12%. Cancer was in Epic Oxford 11% lower among lacto-ovo vegetarians, 12 among pesco vegetarians, and 19% lower among vegans. In the Adventist Health Study 2, 8% lower among lacto-ovo, 12 among pesco, and 16% lower among vegans. Breast cancer in Suchi was 58% lower among the vegetarian participants. And those that had daily isoflavone intake, it had a 63% risk reduction. So soy tending to be especially protective. Cataracts in Epic Oxford were 21% lower among pesco vegetarians, 30% lower among lacto-ovo, and 40% lower among vegans. Suchi, the risk was 20% lower among vegetarians and actually 30% lower among overweight vegetarians, which I found to be very odd. I'm not sure why, but that was their results. And diverticular disease in Epic Oxford, 10% lower among the pesco vegetarians, 27% lower among lacto-ovo vegetarians, and 72% lower among vegans, not surprisingly. Urinary tract infections were 16% lower among the vegetarians in Suchi, and the association was especially strong for females. Gout in Suchi was 77% lower among the vegetarians, and this was the Suchi Health Study, and it was 39% lower in the Suchi Vegetarian Study. And they even had results at Suchi for depression, and it was 30% lower among the vegetarians. Kidney disease was 52% lower in the Adventist Health Study 2. And kidney stones, Epic Oxford found compared to meat eaters that consumed at least 100 grams or 3.5 ounces of meat a day, they had 27% less kidney stones for pesco vegetarians and 31% fewer kidney stones in vegetarians and vegans. And of course, not only do plant-based diets protect against many chronic diseases, but they provide a safe and powerful treatment options. In some case, a treatment option, in some cases, even reversing disease. As I have seen over and over again with clients and with my work in the Marshall Islands and our research in Lithuania, our research demonstration project, we see this. Everyone who's using plant-based diets to treat chronic disease sees this on a regular basis. The good news, of course, is only an estimated 5 to 10% of chronic disease is actually caused by your genes. Healthy lifestyle choices can actually flip genetic switches to help provide protection. And this was illustrated beautifully in this prostate cancer research study by Dean Ornish back in 2008. And what he did was use his intensive lifestyle intervention, which includes stress management and exercise and so forth, but also a plant-based diet for 3 months. And the usual lab measures all improved, but what blew people away was genetic expression change. Nearly 500 cancer-promoting genes were downregulated, and nearly 50 cancer-preventing genes were upregulated. So you really, your genes are not, as the Time magazine article said, are not your destiny. So why are plant-based diets so effective? Well, plant-based diets are so effective because they get to the root causes of disease. They put a lid on inflammation and lipotoxicity and dysbiosis and oxidative stress, thereby helping to, get our bodies back to healthy working order. The most effective dietary patterns minimize pathogenic dietary components and maximize protective dietary components. And when you start to think about the components of food that really offer the greatest protection for human health, you think about things like fiber and phytochemicals and plant enzymes and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds and plant sterols and stanols and pre and probiotics and macro and micronutrients that come from food sources that have all of the above. And when you look at this list, the thing that just jumps off the page at you is these components are found either exclusively or predominantly in whole plant foods. And if you look at the most pathogenic factors in food, the trans fats and the excessive saturated fat and the refined carbohydrates and excessive sodium and the pro-inflammatory molecule Nu-5-GC and the chemical contaminants and the products of high temperature cooking and the pro-oxidants, the TMAO, and the endotoxins that all serve to work against us are concentrated in the 2 categories of foods that the World Health Organization warned us about: highly processed foods and animal products. And the sad reality is most of what consumers eat is a threat to health. And this, unfortunately, I couldn't find Canadian data for this, but we don't eat that differently. US food consumption as a percent of calories, 39% from added fats, oils, and sugar, 30% from animal products, 22% from grains, 90% plus of which are refined, 9% from fruits, vegetables, and legumes. And hence we can understand why we have a problem. But fortunately, we have a choice, or most of us have a choice in what we eat. And here I'd like to share a story about a friend of mine by the name of Andreas. And Andreas, I had the privilege of being his dietitian when he received a rare cancer diagnosis at the age of 36 years. Andreas made a 180-degree shift from being a food and wine aficionado to a whole food, plant-based diet devotee. And his cancer went into remission. And this doesn't happen for everybody, but I can tell you nobody was more diligent than Andreas with his diet. It was incredible. And the story that is the most fascinating about Andreas is when he got put on this pretty high, raw, hardcore, organic, plant-based diet, His entire family, his wife and his brother and his brother's wife and his mom and dad said, Andreas, whatever diet you're on, we're on with you. And it transformed the health of the entire family. It was amazing, the results that they all had, but none was more amazing than what happened to Andreas's father, Carlos. You see, Carlos had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes back in '93. He had had a serious heart attack the year before Andreas's diagnosis. He had hypertension and high cholesterol and peripheral artery disease, and he was going into renal failure. He had recurring gout, and his prognosis was not good. He was told that he had progressive irreversible diseases, and he could expect to live not more than probably a couple of years. He was being treated with 17 pills and 35 to 40 units of insulin per day. After less than 1 year on a whole food, plant-based diet, Carlos was taking 0 insulin and 0 pills. And you know, when Carlos went to his doctor to say, why didn't you tell me that this was possible just by changing my diet? His doctor said, I didn't tell you, Carlos, because I didn't know, and now I do. But if you look at the changes in his health and his lab results, his fasting glucose is now 4.4 to 4.9 millimoles per liter, A1C 5.1, blood pressure 115/70 with no medications. His arteries opened up without surgery, his peripheral artery disease disappeared, his kidney function normalized. He didn't have one single further recurrence of gout. And 9 years later, he's still free of these diseases and these medications. And just to share with you his coronary artery disease reports, you can see in 2005, he had pretty severe heart disease. He had an inferior wall infarct with superimposed ischemia. He had inferior wall hypokinesis. He had a reduced ejection fraction of about 50%. In 2017, no evidence of abnormal cardiac activity, no evidence of ischemia, normal chamber size, normal ejection fraction. It's really quite amazing. And you know, the take-home message here is this is what is possible. And I know not everyone is willing to make the kinds of changes that Carlos made, but I believe that everyone has a right to know that lifestyle changes are a safe and highly effective treatment option, and a right to choose that as a treatment option. The bottom line is we know enough. We know enough to make lifestyle medicine the first-line therapy for individuals with lifestyle-induced diseases. And at this point, I would like to move on to talking about the practical steps that people can take. So 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet. Step number 1, make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. And what we want to aim for is at least 9 servings of colorful vegetables and fruits every day, at least. At least 2 servings of legumes, preferably in the whole form or minimally processed form, legumes, tofu, peas, lentils, even peanuts or peanut butter count. We want to be choosing whole grains, mostly intact, and to vary our intake with our energy needs. We want to include at least 1 serving of nuts and seeds with an omega-3 source in the mix. We want to be very generous with our use of herbs and spices. And why? Well, many reasons. As I mentioned, all of the protective components that are concentrated in these foods. But one of the most important reasons is these are the only foods with fiber. And fiber, as we know, promotes regularity. It's the source of our prebiotics, which is the food for our absolutely essential health microbiome, or a healthy gut microbiome. And this food affects every system in our body. It's extremely important. Fiber increases satiety and reduces cravings. It reduces risk of colorectal cancer. It reduces cholesterol levels. It stabilizes blood sugar. It reduces our risk of GI disorders. It enhances our immune function, and it lessens hormonal imbalances. And if we look at how much we need, well, the RDA is 14 grams per 1,000 calories. That's about 38 grams a day for men and 25 grams a day for women. Optimal intakes are probably closer to 40 to 60 plus grams a day. If you look at actual intakes, people eating a standard North American diet consume about 15 to 17 grams a day on average. People eating a whole food plant-based diet consume about 40 to 80 grams a day on average. If you look at Paleolithic intakes, they ranged from an estimated 70 to 150 plus grams a day. Human beings are meant to be eating a fair bit of fiber. Step number 2 is to be very picky about the carbohydrates we choose. Contrary to popular opinion, carbohydrates are not the enemy. Carbohydrates from whole foods are consistently protective to health. If you look at average intakes in the blue zones, 62% of calories from carbohydrates. Even the Samain from Bolivia, South America, that live a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle and have the lowest rates of heart disease of any population on the planet, consume an average of 72% of calories from carbohydrates. If you look at the data on carbohydrate intake and mortality, this was a study from 2018 with over 100,000 individuals being followed for up to 25 years. You can see that they found the lowest rates of mortality, around 50 to 55% of calories on average. They found the highest mortality with the lowest carbohydrate intakes. And they found a slightly increased mortality with very high carbohydrate intakes, but only when those carbohydrates came from refined sources. So this was in poor populations who were eating a lot of white rice and a lot of white flour products. Now, they also found the very lowest mortality rates with people at the higher end of the carbohydrate spectrum that were not getting those carbohydrates from refined sources. And if we look at longevity in low carb diets, and this is the same study looking at some of their additional data, their ERIC cohort of over 15,000 individuals, compared to the reference 50 to 55% carbohydrate intake, risk of mortality was 58% higher for those with carbohydrate intakes of less than 30%. Now, the carbohydrate intake of people on a keto diet is about 5 to 10%. On a Paleolithic diet or the new paleo diets, it's usually around 20%. So these are low carb diets for sure. It was 32% higher for people eating 30 to 40% of calories from carbohydrate, and 12% higher for those eating 40 to 50% of calories from carbohydrates. You know, this is what carbohydrate naysayers forget. Plant foods are carbohydrate-rich foods. They're high carbohydrate foods. Plant foods provide approximately 60 to 90% of calories from carbohydrates. There's only one exception, and that's nuts and seeds, which are our predominant sources of healthy fats and of essential fatty acids. On the other hand, refined carbohydrates are bad news. What are refined carbohydrates? Well, they're foods that have been stripped of their nutrients by food processing techniques. Refined sugars are part of the picture, and refined starches are part of the picture. Refined carbohydrates increase our risk of overeating and obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, insulin resistance and diabetes, high triglycerides, and heart disease. The problem is that most of the carbohydrates people are eating are refined. If we look at, and again, this is US data because I couldn't find Canadian data, but almost half of the refined sugars in the diet are coming from liquid sugar from beverages, which is quite shocking. And I'm sure it's not that much different in Canada. If we look at safe levels of added sugars, well, the World Health Organization suggests not more than 10% of calories, which is 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. That's the same as the recommendation for the dietary guidelines for Canadians and the dietary guidelines for Americans. Now, the World Health Organization takes it a step further and says less than 5% or 6 teaspoons for additional health benefits. So if you really want to do well, you should be aiming for not more than 6 teaspoons of sugar a day. Average intakes are 17 teaspoons of sugar a day. And for teenagers, it's far higher than that. How much sugar do we get in food? Well, if we're aiming for 6 teaspoons a day, we exceed that with a 12-ounce can of soda or a large flavored coffee or a fruit yogurt or a cinnamon bun. One item in one day. We get close to that just by eating things that we don't even think of as sugar sources, like an energy bar or a quarter cup of barbecue sauce or a package of flavored oatmeal. Now, refined starches, if we take wheat and turn it into white flour, we lose about 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals, and 95% of the protective phytochemicals. And then, of course, nobody eats a bowl of white flour. What do we do before we eat the white flour? Well, we add fat and sugar and salt and all sorts of food additives, and then we eat the white flour. And therein lies the problem. Not only have we stripped the flour of everything of value to human health, but we've added a bunch of pathogenic dietary components before we actually eat the stuff. On the other hand, whole grains are healthy foods. We have a 2016 meta-analysis of 45 studies looking at the mortality, the reduced risk of mortality per 90 grams of intake. That's about 3 servings or 3 ounces of whole grain intake. All-cause mortality was reduced 17%. Cardiovascular disease was reduced 22%. Diabetes by 51%, cancer 15%, and respiratory diseases 22%. But one thing that we need to be aware of is that all whole grains are not created equal. A granola bar doesn't equal a bowl of oatmeal, and a box of kamut flakes does not equal a kamut berry salad. There is a hierarchy of whole grains, and that hierarchy begins with intact whole grains, grains with nothing harmful added, nothing healthful removed, like wheat or kamut or spelt berries, barley, oat groats, or quinoa. Next on the list are broken whole grains like steel cut oats and cracked wheat, and then rolled whole grains like rolled oats or rolled barley or rye, then shredded whole grains like shredded wheat, then ground whole grains like whole wheat flour products, then flaked whole grains like cold flaked cereals. And at the bottom of the list are puffed whole grains like puffed wheat, rice, or millet. And please remember, this chart doesn't include refined grains at all. This is just whole grains. And as the degree of processing increases in those whole grains, as you go down this chart, what you see is an increase in the glycemic index. You see an increase in the surface area of the grain and the rate at which the grain will be absorbed into the bloodstream. As you go down this list and you get more and more processing, you also see destruction of nutrients. They are exposed to heat and light and air and so forth. And so what you want to do if you're trying to prevent disease or reverse, especially reverse disease, you want to stay as high on that whole grain hierarchy as possible. So carbohydrate common sense is simple. Get your carbohydrates from high fiber whole plant foods. Avoid added sugars, especially in beverages, and minimize all refined carbohydrates, both starches and sugars. Step number 3, get your protein from legumes instead of meat. Why? Because when you look at the protective components in food, legumes are consistently high or very high in those components, and meat has basically nothing. It's all 0 or extremely low in these components. When you look at the components that we're trying to minimize to reduce our disease risk, they're either low or 0 in legumes, and they are generally moderate or high in meat. And of course, when we look at the stats on mortality, legumes are consistently associated with reduced mortality. We have a 2017 meta-analysis that reported a 7% risk reduction in the highest versus the lowest intake groups. And the reason it wasn't higher, in my opinion, is because the highest intake groups hardly ate any legumes. They were eating very small amounts, so there wasn't that big of a difference. We have another study that's even more powerful that looked at people 70 years of age or more, and they reported a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality for every 2/3 of an ounce of legumes consumed, or 20 grams. So that's what, 2 tablespoons or less. It's quite shocking. Now, if on the other hand, we look at red meat and mortality, we see a very different picture. I couldn't find a meta-analysis or study looking at this that didn't find an increased risk with red and processed meat intake. And you can see the processed meat in light pink has a more profound impact than unprocessed red meat. But regardless, they all increase risk of mortality, as they do diabetes, heart disease, cancer. Very, very consistently. There was a study from Harvard looking at over 130,000 individuals followed for 30 years that found that replacing only 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein reduced risk of death. And 3% of calories amounts to about 60 calories in a 2,000 calorie diet. Replacing 60 calories from processed red meat with plant protein reduces risk of death by 34%, or reduced risk of death by 34% in this cohort. Replacing egg protein with plant protein, 19%. And that's 60 calories worth of egg protein. That's not even one large egg. Unprocessed meat, it reduced risk by 12%, replacing it with plant protein. For dairy, it was 8%, and for fish and chicken, it was 6%. We have another study that had even more powerful impact by replacing 3% of calories from meat with plant protein. And this study came from Japan, over 70,000 individuals, followed for about 20 years. And replacing just 3% of red meat with plant protein reduced risk of total mortality 34%. And if it was processed meat, it was 46%. For cancer mortality, replacing red meat with plant protein to 60 calories in a 2,000 calorie diet reduced risk of death by 42% and by 50% for processed red meat. And then finally, a study that just came out in 2020 with over 400,000 individuals followed for 16 years. They found replacing 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein reduced mortality by 10%. And if you replaced eggs, it was 24% for men and 21% for women. If it was red meat, it was 13% for men, 15% for women. For dairy, it was 8%. And for poultry, or for white meat, it was 2% for men and 5% for women. So not quite as strong. And yes, people can get enough protein from eating plants, as do all of the men in this picture. Each one of them is 100% plant-based. Step number 4 is to replace harmful fat with healthful fat. High-fat, whole plant foods are rich in fiber and antioxidants and plant sterols and stanols and phytochemicals and all of these good things, whereas concentrated fats and oils have a low nutrient density. They have a lot of calories with few nutrients, so we want to limit those sources, especially for people who are trying to reverse disease. We want to cut back on saturated fat. Now, the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology guidelines for heart disease risk reductions actually suggest no more than 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat. And that would be about 11 to 13 grams on a 2,000 calorie diet. If you look at the amount of saturated fat in various foods, you can see animal products, just a couple slices of meat lovers pizza, a double cheeseburger, a soft taco with beef and cheese, and you're already way above the upper limit. A cup of milk, 7 grams, an ounce of cheese, 5 grams. These numbers add up very quickly. By contrast, if you look at the saturated fat in high-fat plant foods like nuts and seeds and tofu and olives and these high-fat plant foods, you're getting, a gram or less in most of these foods, 2 grams in avocado. The only exceptions in the plant-based world are, of course, tropical oils and coconut, which is a little higher in saturated fat. We also, when it comes to fat, want to minimize our exposure to damaged fats. When we fry high-fat foods or we fry in oil, we produce products of oxidation that can be very damaging to human health. And we want to minimize oils in cooking. And if they're used, we don't want the heat to be high enough that the oils will actually smoke. And we want to store high-fat foods, including shelled nuts and seeds, in the refrigerator or freezer if possible. We want to optimize omega-3s. So we need to ensure a source of alpha-linolenic acid, get at least 2 to 4 grams a day, and consider direct sources of EPA and DHA, those very biologically active long-chain omega-3s. So plant sources of omega-3 ALA, well, we get about 2.6 grams in an ounce of walnuts, about 2.5 in a tablespoon of chia seeds, 1.6 in a tablespoon of ground flaxseed, about a gram in a tablespoon of hemp seeds. We get less than a 0.1 gram in a cup of greens. Even though half the fat in greens is omega-3, we would have to eat 20 or 30 cups a day to meet our 2 to 3 gram intake. Now, the other thing is we can consume microalgae-based supplements. And a lot of people don't realize, but fish actually get their omega-3s from tiny little plants in the ocean called microalgae. Microalgae is where EPA and DHA are essentially manufactured. And what we can do is we can, culture this stuff and extract the EPA and DHA and take it in supplement form. Some people are not very good at converting. Technically, humans can convert plant omega-3s into these biologically active long-chain omega-3s, but some people aren't very efficient at conversion, particularly people that have diabetes or hypertension or other metabolic disorders. EPA and DHA microalgae supplements are very widely available, and they're not that expensive anymore. Generally, what is recommended is 200 to 300 milligrams per day. Some people may need a little bit more than that. Step 5 is to maximize our intake of phytochemicals and antioxidants. How do we do that? Think variety. We want to think variety for many reasons. Antioxidants and phytochemicals are another reason. The greater the variety we consume, the greater the variety of these compounds we'll be consuming. We want to also think color, because the richest sources of phytochemicals and antioxidants are often also the most colorful. So to maximize protective phytochemicals and antioxidants, you want to choose purple instead of white onions, black instead of brown rice, dark instead of light greens, for example. You want to eat the entire rainbow of vegetables and fruits. So what I would recommend is at least 3 green, 2 orange yellow, 2 pink red, 1 purple blue, 1 white beige every day. And one of the things that I try to do as a personal challenge is to get every color in the rainbow represented in my salads, which I consume on a daily basis. The other thing we can do is to eat more raw foods, and people will wonder why more raw foods. But one of the reasons that plant enzymes can be protective is because these enzymes, like myrosinase, can actually help to convert the phytochemicals into foods into their bioactive metabolites. So for example, myrosinase in cruciferous vegetables helps us to convert glucosinolates to isothiocyanates, which are more biologically active, like sulforaphane, which helps to kick the phase 2 enzyme system into full gear and helps to get rid of carcinogens and turn them into water-soluble compounds and excrete them. It also, alanase in the allium vegetable family helps to convert allan to the active form allicin. And allicin is associated with antiviral and antifungal and all sorts of benefits as well. We can start sprouting. The phytochemical army that's poised to protect these delicate new little plants actually multiplies 5 to 50 times when we sprout foods. And we can pile on the herbs and spices, because there are no foods that are actually more concentrated per gram in antioxidants and phytochemicals than herbs and spices. We can also drink antioxidant-rich teas like hibiscus tea and ginger tea and turmeric tea and matcha tea and all of these different teas. And step 6 is to minimize dietary contaminants. So the worst offenders are environmental contaminants and byproducts of high temperature cooking. So let's talk about a little bit about environmental contaminants like pesticides in conventional produce or in animals that have eaten a lot of pesticide-laden food. Heavy metals like mercury in fish and seafood, and arsenic in rice, chicken, fish, and seaweed, and persistent organic pollutants like PCBs, DDT, and dioxins, which move up the food chain and are concentrated in animal products. So the solutions here are really to eat lower on the food chain, to choose organic when we have that option or when we're able to choose that option. And if we're not able to choose organic all the time, one of the things we can do is use tools like the environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen and Clean 15, and try to choose organic as much as possible for the Dirty Dozen. And if we buy conventional, to buy conventional in that Clean 15 list that have lower levels of pesticides. We want to vary our grains. Inorganic arsenic can cause cancer and increase the risk of diabetes. And rice is one of our most concentrated source of inorganic arsenic. So we want to just eat, just a wider variety of grains. We want to, when we do eat rice, or if rice is a staple for us, carefully select it. For example, rice from California has less arsenic than rice grown in some of the more eastern or central states. And if we cook rice that we're not sure about, cook it in a lot of water. It works out perfectly. You can do 6 to 10 times more water than rice, and then just drain it. And when you drain that water, you're getting rid of some 80 to 85% of the arsenic. The products of high temperature cooking like heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and acrylamide and advanced glycation end products need to be minimized as well. And we need to be aware of these things. These are the products of high temperature cooking. So heterocyclic amines are carcinogens. They're known carcinogens. They are formed only from animal products like meat, poultry, fish, and eggs when they're cooked at high temperatures. Plant foods don't form heterocyclic amines because they don't contain creatine or creatinine, and those are required for the formation of heterocyclic amines. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are known mutagens linked with a number of cancers. They are present in grilled or charred or blackened foods, if you will. And it doesn't matter if they're plant or animal. Any food you blacken will contain polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. It's just really formed from the incomplete burning of carbon-containing substances in food that's heated above 392 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees centigrade. Advanced glycation end products impair immune system function, they accelerate aging, and they contribute to multiple disease processes, including Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, and cancers. If we look at the amounts in foods, what you see is at the top of the list is things like bacon and broiled frankfurters and boiled frankfurters, so processed meat. And then next on the list, you see, grilled or fried meat, poultry, fish, butter, grilled or fried tofu, and then other foods, including roasted nuts or seeds, especially if they're roasted to fairly dark, snack foods and those kinds of foods. Acrylamide is formed when high carbohydrate foods are heated above 248 degrees Fahrenheit or 120 degrees centigrade. And foods that are rich in the amino acid asparagine form the greatest amounts of acrylamide. And acrylamide has been classified as a probable human carcinogen. And if you look at acrylamide in foods, you can see at the very top of the list are sweet potato chips and potato chips, because potatoes are high in asparagine. And so they're right up there. And then going down the list, you see rye crisp bread and French fries and coffee and nut and seed butters and so on. Very, very low amounts in those foods. But any carbohydrate containing food can form acrylamide. And the solutions here, just avoid charred or blackened foods, especially meat, poultry, or fish. Avoid fried foods and use moist cooking methods when you can, like steaming and stewing and boiling and water sauteing, because they produce fewer products of oxidation. Eat whole foods, avoid highly processed foods. And finally, step number 7 is to meet your need for all nutrients. You don't want to develop nutritional deficiencies without overeating calories. You want to maintain a healthy body weight throughout life. And when you're consuming a plant-based diet, you'll be focusing on different micronutrients that you might need to be really focused on with an omnivorous diet. With an omnivorous diet, you might not get enough potassium, you might not get enough vitamin E, there are other nutrients of concern. Of course, one of the foods that we can do to help ensure that we're eating a healthful diet is to use a food guide. And I think Canada's food guide is something we can be very, very proud of. It's probably the most progressive food guide on the planet, with half the plate as fruits and vegetables, a quarter as grains, and a quarter as protein foods, with an emphasis on choosing mainly plant sources of protein. And the guides in in the books that I've co-authored are similar. We've got a plate, but we've also got these add-ons at the top of the plate where, even if you eat this entire plate, there are some nutrients that you still need to think about: omega-3s, B12, iodine, and vitamin D, and a similar guide in becoming vegan as well. And so we want to really focus on eating more nutrient-dense foods. And what are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet? Well, number 1 is green leafy vegetables. This is the aggregate nutrient density index by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. And it's based on vitamins, minerals, fiber, and ORAC score. So it's an interesting compilation of, just all of these things. And so fruits and vegetables at the top, and then other plant foods and fish somewhere in the middle. And then we've got milk, meat, poultry, eggs, cheese. And then at the bottom of the barrel, French fries, vegetable oil. And the only thing that's below that is pure sugar. So those are things to be aware of. We want to be drinking water, not sugar. And to minimize food with added fat, sugar, and salt, and to increase our physical activity. I think an hour a day of moderate to vigorous activity is ideal, but we want a minimum of 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous activity. We want to avoid supersizing except for salad. And the take-home message here is every time you eat or drink, you either feed disease or you fight disease. Well-designed, whole food, plant-based diets provide a powerful and effective means of fighting disease. The good news is that the power of plant-based diets extend far beyond ourselves. There is probably no more powerful step that any individual human being can take towards the preservation of planet Earth than to consume a plant-based diet. It's simply the most ecologically sustainable way of eating that we know of. And there was a study that just came out in 2020 looking at climate change mitigation through dietary change. And it was a systematic review of 18 studies. And what they found was, compared to current food consumption patterns, greenhouse gas emissions would be about 25% lower with sustainable diets that are lower in animal foods, higher in plant foods, but 70% lower with vegan diets. And the greatest benefits for both health and the environment were associated with vegan diets. And of course, a plant-based diet is an ethically justifiable way of eating. When we look around the world, over 70 billion land animals, and that's not including anything from the ocean, are slaughtered for food every year globally. Over 90% of those are raised in CAFOs, or essentially factory farms. Eating plants spares animals, and to me, it makes no sense to cause pain, suffering, and death in other living beings when it is not only unnecessary, but it undermines the life support systems of humanity. Animal-based diets breed human hunger. The greater our meat intake, the more resources we use and the fewer people we feed. If everyone ate plant-based, the global calorie supply would increase by an estimated 50%, which could effectively wipe out hunger. By getting our nutrition from plants, we all win. and we have a choice when we consider the consequences of our food choices, both for ourselves and beyond ourselves. A plant-based diet becomes both an ecological and an ethical imperative. And I would like to conclude my presentation by telling you the rest of the story about my dad. You see, about 2 years after that interaction we had, my dad had a stroke. He was rushed to the hospital by ambulance and hadn't seen a doctor for 20 years. His blood pressure was 220/110. His blood sugar was almost 29 to 30 millimoles per liter, or over 500 milligrams per deciliter. His blood vessels were in really, really rough shape. And I can remember the doctor telling my dad that if you stop smoking, you might live 3 years. My dad wasn't even 50. He wasn't even 50. He was 49 years of age. And if you don't stop smoking, you have about 3 months. And after the doctor left, I remember sitting on my dad's bed, and the two of us, we were in tears. And my dad said to me, he said, "I don't want to die." And I think it was at this point that my dad first realized that without health, your freedom is very quickly snatched away. And he said, I don't even have grandchildren yet. I want to see my grandchildren grow up. He said, "I want to dance with my sweetheart at our 50th wedding anniversary." He and my mom were always madly in love. And you know, my dad made some changes. He never made the changes, the kind of extreme changes that Carlos made, but he made enough changes to beat the odds and dance with my mom at their 50th wedding anniversary. And that for me, my dad died in 2011. And so I am very grateful for the extra years we had, and that he did get to see his grandchildren grow up. And with that, I will, these are just some of my books, and I will conclude and say thank you very much.